So welcome everybody to the first Cirque seminar, which appropriately takes place on the first day of the semester. If anybody says that Cirque is slow off the starting block, they're clearly wrong.
I never said that.
I just look at you, Dan. I'm not accusing you of anything. And we're very pleased at this initial seminar of the semester to have Dr. Ali Morgenbesser with us today. He is a lecturer in the School of Government in International Relations at Griffith University I just visited in lovely Brisbane. As I said, he's a lecturer there, and crucially, and very important to mention also for his presence here, and we're very grateful for him being a self-financing speaker to us today. He's a recipient of the Discovery Early Career Research Award from the Australian Research Council, which runs from this year to 2020. So again, congratulations on that, and thanks for making use of that as one of the first things you do coming here. So we much appreciate that. His most recent book is Behind the Facade, Elections Under Authoritarianism in Southeast Asia, a SUNY Press book 2016, and he has a forthcoming book, which is what you're talking about today, The Rise of Sophisticated Authoritarianism in Southeast Asia, which will be published by Cambridge in next year. In addition, he's published articles in Asian Studies, Review, Contemporary Politics, Democratization, European Journal of East Asia Studies, Political Studies, and the Pacific Review. And as you'll see, his research areas are authoritarianism, democratization, flawed elections, and of course, Southeast Asian politics. So we're very pleased indeed, Lee, for you to be here today, and very much look forward to the talk and to the discussion afterwards. So let's welcome Lee.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. Thank you for having me. I haven't been to Hong Kong before, so it's nice to visit a new city. It's a bit colder than I thought it would be. Just come from the Brisbane summer, which was 38 degrees on the day I left. So that's a bit of an adjustment for me. So this presentation I'm going to give today is basically road testing the theory of my forthcoming book, which is due at Cambridge University Press later this year. And so it's a little bit theory heavy, but I do have some empirical data towards the end that I'm keen to get a lot of feedback on. A very basic outline. I'm going to define my research problem and why it is a problem and worth studying. I'm going to propose a new, and what I think is a very original hypothesis around this idea of sophisticated authoritarianism and its counterpart, or its opposite, retrograde authoritarianism. I'm going to discuss how I've evaluated these two concepts and judged them and scored them using a standardized index. And then I'm going to present some data basically tying in every authoritarian regime in Southeast Asia since 1974. And then I'll have a conclusion at the end. So the basic outline of the research problem, I think, is fairly straightforward. And I want to present you with some empirical examples, both very recently, meaning this happens on really a weekly basis, but also from months or years ago. So a simple explanation: how do we explain the use of libel suits against civil society activists in Singapore, such as online bloggers critical of the government or its policies? How do we explain the deployment of an anti-corruption commission to silence rivals to Prime Minister Razak's rule in Malaysia? How do we explain the hiring of a Washington DC public relations firm by the junta in Thailand, not the first instance of this happening in Southeast Asia? How do we explain the alliance between the United Russia Party and the Cambodian People's Party, signed in 2015, and it's going to come to fruition next year when Russia sends its observers for the election, which I'm sure is going to be interesting. And how do we explain the attack on democracy activists by online, quote, opinion shapers in Vietnam? So there was an article last week. Apparently the Vietnamese Communist Party has 10,000 opinion shapers that they use to support their rule. Now what I want to suggest to begin is that while these events or these actions look disparate, I mean they don't look related or connected to each other in any way, I would like to connect them. And what I want to suggest is that they are all part of what I think is certainly a regional pattern, but even a global pattern, which is the rise of sophisticated authoritarianism. So if we were to address this problem, meaning how would we explain those events or those actions, you could turn to a fairly rich and sophisticated body of scholarship. So since at least 1999, with the publication of Barbara Getter's article in the Annual Review of Political Science, which he laid out these different types of authoritarian regimes. This very welcome and sizable body of scholarship has emerged from within the field of comparative democratization, or what you might call comparative authoritarianism. And my research, at least up until now, fits very comfortably within this body of research. I think it's a great body of research. It's found a lot of different outcomes and produced a lot of great research. Two authors, however, address a problem. So Tom Popinski, writing in the British Journal of Political Science 2014, says, students of authoritarianism will profit from systematically examining the non-institutional features of authoritarian rule. All this will require detailed knowledge of individual regimes. And Dawn Brancati in the same year says, research has to move to a broader conceptual level while still retaining detailed evidence gained from the case studies. Now, their criticism was essentially the same, even though they published in different papers. They were essentially arguing that the focus on institutions, meaning nominally democratic institutions in authoritarian regimes, while welcome, had produced sort of two problems. One, scholars couldn't distinguish the effect of institutions from the effect of other outcomes. Okay, so they did not know whether an election was causing stability or survival, or it was some other institution such as the legislature or party that was doing the same thing. Okay, so they basically, they don't take a swipe, but they suggest that the focus on the institutions, while it has been welcome up to this point, has been productive, we need to move to a broader conceptual level if we're really going to explain authoritarianism. And this is where I take my cue from. So if you look at that literature and how it would explain the five sort of events I put at the start, you come up with sort of three main critiques. So conceptually, there's a lack of a framework capable of synthesizing different techniques identified by scholars. So if we were trying to put all those five techniques that I identified at the start into one framework, there would be no framework to do that, okay? While they look disparate or disconnected, I would argue that they are connected. And then we lack a testable set of propositions about how these new innovative techniques affect various outcomes in authoritarian regimes. So up until now, the main outcome scholars in this field have investigated is survival. It's the most interesting. Why do some authoritarian regimes survive and why do others perish? Okay. But if we look at the rise of sophisticated authoritarianism, we lack a testable set of propositions about how these techniques themselves affect those outcomes. We know about elections, we know about parties, legislatures, courts, okay, but we don't know about the online use of opinion shapers affects authoritarian regimes and whatever outcome you're investigating. And even if we did, we'd certainly lack cross-national data about this, okay? So while I identified 5 techniques, which I think are fairly original and fairly new, there's certainly no data pinpointing when this started in which country and how long this has been going on for. So I take my cue from this and I say the development of retrograde and sophisticated authoritarianism is currently a theory-building mission. I'll explain why shortly, aimed at introducing a bit more balance to the study of authoritarian policies. So my question is straightforward. How have authoritarian regimes in Southeast Asia adapted the way they rule in an era of democratization? So this is the question as it stands at the moment, and I'm fairly confident the question is going to change once I try to start making a more causal argument here. Okay, once I get into the field and start investigating individual case studies. And I suggest that authoritarian regimes have made their rule less retrograde and more sophisticated. The ostensible goal is to continuously exemplify the virtues of democracy without succumbing to democratization. So how democratic can you look without actually being a democracy? Okay, put simply. And I think that the result is fairly straightforward. So if you're a sophisticated authoritarian regime, you're more agile, effective, and hospitable, okay, particularly to citizens. And then you're more capable of diminishing the 2 sort of key threats, elite-driven coup and mass-led overthrow. I'll put some more meat in the bone shortly when I get to the empirical section. So what is sophisticated authoritarianism? Sounds somewhat elegant, but I'll try to be more specific. Okay, so what they try to do is exemplify the virtues of democracy by promoting, or pretending to promote, sort of 5 key virtues. So accountability, meaning they try to be democratic in the sense that they are responsive to the needs of citizens. They are responsive to the rule of law. Okay, they investigate corruption, even though they may be perpetrating at the same time. Okay? They encourage contestation. Typically, elections is sort of the best representation of this. So they encourage competitive elections rather than no elections at all. And this is the simple terms at this stage. Okay? They try to build equality, meaning economic equality in particular, but social equality as well. Okay, so rather than simply hoarding developmental gains amongst the core elite or ruling coalition, okay, who all enrich themselves, they try to distribute it as well. And sort of China more broadly is a good representation of this, where the living standard is continuously improved. They also encourage participation in the political process. Okay? If you have a problem with government, you are encouraged to bring that problem to the government, even though they are authoritarian, okay? Rather than just keep secrets. And then finally, in part, if you have a legislature, which you should by this stage, they encourage that legislature to be representative of the entire population, rather than just particular ethnic or religious groups. Okay? And on the whole, retrograde authoritarian regimes do none of these things at the aggregate level. Okay? So what I want to suggest, at least at this stage, is that you can be both at the same time. You can be retrograde in how you use institutions, but you can be sophisticated in how you use repression. Okay, so it's not necessarily one or the other, you can be both at the same time. If I was to define sort of the ethos of this approach to authoritarianism, to this approach to authoritarian politics, I'd sort of distill it into this one sentence, which is good for getting book contracts and grant applications accepted. Obviously I'll go into far more detail in this, but it sort of illustrates what I think is a change that's occurred. I'm not sure exactly when the changes happened, but I think there was a change. Whereas once you had these retrograde dictatorships, okay, where they didn't attempt to appear anything other than what they are. Okay, there's still cases of this today, not necessarily in Southeast Asia. I mean, Thailand's probably the closest, Brunei, okay, but I'll talk about that. But think about Turkmenistan, North Korea, Eritrea, places like that. They're not trying to trick you in any way. They are retrograde dictatorships. Okay? Sophisticated authoritarian regimes do the opposite. They're trying to convince you of something that they're not. Okay? So, what I want to argue is that the qualitative differences between authoritarian regimes exist across 5 basic dimensions. The first one I call institutional configuration. So while I depart from the sort of the literature, the classic literature in my field, which is focused heavily on institutions. Institutions are still important, okay, but they're just one piece of the puzzle. Okay, they are not the ultimate sort of guarantee of survival in any way. Okay, so elections, parties, legislatures, courts, things like that, constitutions, they are all still relevant. But what I want to suggest is that there are more sophisticated types of elections and more sophisticated versions of constitutions than elsewhere. So you can have a very retrograde constitution that doesn't pretend to be anything. Okay, it clearly defines who rules and how they rule and why they rule. Okay. Number 2 is what I call control mechanism. Okay, so this mainly takes into consideration how the regime uses repression, but also importantly co-optation, okay, which is arguably the more sophisticated type of modeling power. Okay, but not only how they use repression, why do they use repression, who do they target against, and what level of repression do they use? Okay. Third is what I call information management. Okay, so this is basically how do authoritarian regimes collect and disseminate information? And this is particularly important based on what they call the dictator's dilemma, which is the idea that no dictator can ever truly know whether somebody supports him or supports him because he commands their support. So is support for a dictator actually genuine, or is it just because they demand obedience? Okay? So it's important for these regimes to collect information in particular and disseminate it at the same time. So this is where things like propaganda, censorship, the use of the internet come into things like, so online opinion shapers would fall very much under this. fourth is the governing model. Okay, so this is where we tie in theories about patron-client relationships, where we tie in the use of corruption as a tool, okay, and where we tie in developmental gains. So if you take the example of China, I won't be speaking about China today, but it is a good example of this. Okay, so massive economic development, okay, stimulating growth, but distributing the benefits of that growth for the most part within the population, okay, and then basing their legitimacy on that. And then finally, international engagement. So there's been a very sizable, well, not sizable, but there's been a very recent addition to my field, which is this idea of the internationalization of authoritarian rule. So how are these regimes cooperating internationally to serve their own needs? So the example I gave earlier of the alliance between United Russia and the Cambodian People's Party is sort of a simple example of this. Keeping in mind that United Russia has apparently signed like 43 of these agreements internationally. Okay, not just in Southeast Asia, but especially in Eastern Europe. So how do they cooperate internationally? How do different techniques diffuse from one country to the next? Okay. Now the reason why I've underlined the first three is that today they're the only ones I'll be speaking about. As I said, this is very much a work in progress, and I simply haven't done the theory building part of number 4 and 5. So let me give you some examples, just to flesh out the bones a bit. Okay, so this is the example just as it pertains to elections. Okay, and I'll try to be as specific as I can here. So I would argue that a sophisticated authoritarian regime sanctions elections to begin with. Okay, as I said, there's a sizable body of scholarship, and the evidence suggests that holding elections is better for survival than not holding them. Okay, now granted, there's short-term risks associated with holding them, but over the long term, the benefits are clear. Okay, so if you're looking at the first one, it's basically the difference between present-day Thailand and Brunei, which don't sanction elections, especially Thailand under the junta, and everybody else in Southeast Asia. Okay? But then you get into questions of, well, is the election competitive or uncompetitive? Okay, so here you can make a distinction between Vietnam and Laos, which are uncompetitive one-party elections, and everybody else that holds elections. And third, you get into the more specific details of if they do sanction competitive elections, how do they run them? How do they mitigate these short-term risks that have been identified by the scholarship? And I suggest a number of ways. So, do they have an administrative body, and how much power does that election administrative body have? Okay, you don't want it to be completely autonomous, because then it can turn against you if you're the dictator. Okay, especially if you've stolen the election. And so sort of Myanmar's 1990 election is a good example of that. But then you don't want it to be controlled, because if it's controlled, that decreases the integrity of the election and raises questions about it. So the best, I would argue, the best plan you can have is for it to be ambiguous, where no one knows what its actual function is, and it only performs its function when you require it to do so. And then fourth, and relatedly, scheduling of elections. I've done work in another paper that was published in Pacific Review about the timing of elections in Singapore. If you look at the timing of elections in Singapore, they range anywhere from 69 days before the mandated period is supposed to finish, to anywhere up to sort of 686 days. Okay? So what that does is it allows the People's Action Party to keep the opposition off their toes, essentially. Because if the opposition doesn't know when elections are going to come, you have a greater advantage. Okay? Whereas you compare that to, let's say, Cambodia, where elections are the last Sunday in July every 5 years. Okay, so the opposition, if it's allowed to exist, knows when the election is and can plan accordingly. There's been a lot of research in recent years about these two next ones, so boycott by the opposition and the existence of opposition coalition, both of which have been identified as being, I guess, bad for the survival of authoritarian regimes. Okay, so if you take opposition coalition, where two or more opposition parties unite as one on one ticket, okay, where they maybe have one candidate or one policy platform, okay, this has been shown to be detrimental to the survival of authoritarian regimes. So a retrograde regime allows this, or can't stop it, And a sophisticated authoritarian regime has done all the hard work up until then to stop it, okay, maybe through co-optation or repression. And then finally, the deployment of fake parties, which I would argue is one of the more innovative tactics you can do. So you use people that are loyal to you in a hidden way to create fake parties and run in the elections. Okay? So this is one of Putin's tactics in Russia. And so what I'm trying to find out is whether regimes in Southeast Asia have done this in the past or are doing it now, although granted it's hard to identify what's fake and what's not. So that's just an example of, as it pertains to elections, but there's the theory folds in things like legislatures and parties and stuff like that. Here's an example as it pertains to the control mechanism. Okay, so there's various hazards that have been identified for authoritarian regimes. So the first three have traditionally been coded by banks and these sort of cross-national data sets. Now, obviously, I don't think this requires too much explanation, but if you have an anti-government demonstration, there's a risk that that demonstration could overflow and lead into the fall of the regime. So a retrograde dictatorship or regime allows this or can't stop it, and a sophisticated authoritarian regime prevents this. Okay, so again, Singapore is a good example. If you look at the data, anti-government demonstrations are at zero and have been for decades now. The fourth one is particularly important, a defection from the ruling coalition. If you've been following events in Malaysia just for the last week, okay, you have Mahathir now running as an opposition head, which is crazy. Although he didn't defect, it illustrates the problem with defection, because previous insiders in the regime can defect, form their own opposition party, and then run against the dictator or the ruling party. Okay, so that's a hazard that needs to be controlled. And then fifth and finally, very obvious one, coup attempt. If there's a coup attempt in any given year, this suggests that you're doing something wrong as a dictator or ruling party, because it illustrates that there's been a split or a fracture within the ruling coalition. And I don't sort of need to suggest too much about why a coup is bad for a dictator. Okay. And then finally on this one, I want to identify different techniques that are used against opposition actors, because I would argue that some are far more politically costly than others, okay, and some are far more subtle than others. So just in the last sort of year, if you've been following the news in Cambodia, you've had one opposition leader, Sam Rainsy, he's fled to Paris, he has a mansion in, so it's probably not too bad, and then you've had Kem Sokha, who's currently in jail under arbitrary charges. Okay, so the problem with these techniques is they're very arbitrary. Everyone takes notice of them. You get international pressure, international news, things like that. I would argue that the more sophisticated thing you want to do is, if you're a dictator, is you use the legal system to your benefit, which you control for the most part. Okay, you file libel or defamation suits. Okay, this is the Singapore way. Okay. Or you use a regulatory infraction. I haven't found many examples of this, but sort of the famous one. Again from Russia, Putin's a bit of an innovator. He used the fire department to close down the opposition headquarters because of building violations. It's subtle, okay? It's far more subtle than killing somebody. And if you're good enough, you can actually co-opt opposition leaders into the regime apparatus, which is easily the least political costly. And then some more examples just on information management, which is the last one I'll talk about today. I said that authoritarian regimes, or at least sophisticated ones, want to be accountable to citizens. Okay? They want to appear to be accountable. A good way to do this relates to counterclaims. If citizens or opposition parties, or civil society groups in particular, raise an alternative narrative or have an alternative idea about the direction of the country or policy, what do authoritarian regimes do with this alternative? I would argue that retrograde regimes simply don't allow them or punish them. They allow them or degrade them, or they acknowledge and reconcile, okay, which has its risk. The sophisticated regimes, they acknowledge but don't actually action, or they accept them but later don't actually do anything about them. Okay, so essentially, if you look at it, anytime there's a mass protest, for example, and there's demands from demonstrators, okay, one thing you can do if you're a sophisticated regime is you accept their demands. You say, I'm going to make concessions. I will amend the Constitution. And then 6 months down the road, you don't do it. At least it diffuses the problem in the short term. instead of actually just crushing the protest. The other examples here are basically about different tactics that have been sort of identified. Gongos, anyone heard of this term? Okay, government-operated non-government organisations. Okay, so instead of having non-government organisations, you build your own non-government organisations to sort of suggest policy for you and to back the policy that you have. And I'll just touch on the last two there. There's a lot of research that's looked at election observation and answering sort of two questions. Why would authoritarian regimes allow election observers into a country? And if they do allow them, what are the costs and benefits associated with that decision? On the whole, the research suggests that there's more benefits to be gained, particularly international benefits, so you can get membership in international organisations, foreign direct investment, things like that. The last one here down the bottom is sort of some research I've done arguing that instead of not allowing observers or fully allowing observers, what you want to do is half allow them, which is basically what we call a mock compliance strategy. Okay, essentially, instead of fully complying, which has costs, especially if they find your election to be faulty or in some way, and fully not complying, which has costs, you allow groups that you've created into the country, what I call shadow observation groups. Okay, so you get people to build their own observation groups, you bring them into the country, you pay them to come in, they give you election tick of approval, clean bill of health, and then they leave. And while that may not be true, you can at least use their judgment of the election off against another judgment, and that way you're just left with factual relativity. All right, so there's some examples. As I said, it's not like the full complement of what the theory talks about, but I wanted to give you some examples to sort of just make a suggestion. All right, so with all this information, what am I going to do with it? So where I'm at the moment, I've been writing up the theory for the book manuscript and developing what I call a sophisticated authoritarian regimes data set, the SAR data set, and creation of standardized scores, which is what I'm going to present to you today. Step 2, which I haven't done, is field research in selected cases, archival work, interviews, process tracing, and description to unpack the causal mechanism. So I'm not making a causal argument at this stage. I'm not trying to figure out whether sophisticated authoritarianism explains the lack of democratization in Southeast Asia. I'm not trying to do that yet. Maybe eventually I will. But at this stage, I'm just trying to figure out how they have adapted, okay, over a course of a few decades. So, as I said, I'm going to introduce the standardized scores. So I'm going to present to you and tell you what I think, which regimes are retrograde, which are sophisticated, and how that's changed over time. So by a standardized score, so the data set codes 12 authoritarian regimes across 10 countries over a 40-year period. The reason why there's 12 and 10 is that Thailand's had multiple experiences of authoritarianism, which is actually frustrating. I'll explain why in a second. And it uses, so those tables that I've presented, the examples, uses 102 ordinal features. Okay, so what I'm basically arguing is whether you kill an opposition leader or co-opt an opposition, there's a fundamental difference in quality there. Okay, and I've coded those. I've built a code book and then coded them. So what I'm presenting today is just 59, just a lot, 59 features. Okay, and what counts as best practice is the existing scholarship, but also the adherence or nominal adherence to the virtues of democracy. And then the results are standardized on a scale ranging from 0, most retrograde, to 100, most sophisticated. You could adjust that to 0 to 50 or whatever it may be. All right, so the overall picture, I'm doing time. The overall picture I'll present just by dimension. Okay, so this simply represents each of the dimensions down the bottom. So institutional configuration, control mechanism, information management. Okay? When you just look at all the countries across the dimensions, not much of a story here. The sort of the big change occurs here. Okay, information management goes up after the end of the Cold War. It's basically down to changes in how censorship is performed in these countries. So make it far less direct and far less overt, and then increase election observation after the Cold War as well. Okay, so that table suggests, or the graph suggests, not too much going on, so it's worth digging a bit deeper. So I'll present the cases of democratization first. Mark, this one's for you. Alright, so this is the Philippines, 1974 to 86 under Marcos. A couple of things stand out here. One, I think I have a problem with the country sample. So the regimes are coded using Getter's Right and Friends data set, which codes every authoritarian regime in the world from, I think it's 1950 to 2014. So I think I might need to stop it at 1985. Memory serves me, Marcos goes down, or Marcos quits in February 1986. So that means I probably need to finish at 1985. Anyway, so one thing stands out for me with this is that the off-election years. Okay, so all the spikes that you see here, okay, are election years, meaning regimes get more sophisticated in election years, not only because they hold elections, but because they manage those hazards that I identified. But in the off-election years, the use of information management and the use of control by Marcos was lower, far lower actually, relative to other regimes in the region. Okay, so if I was going to make a causal argument eventually, I'd want to look at this data and to try and figure out whether this lowering or decreasing contributed to his fall. Okay. This is Thailand from 1977 to 1988. So officially, Thailand is coded as authoritarian from 77 to 88, 1992, just 1 year, 2006, just 1 year, and then 2014 onwards. Okay, that's different, obviously, to the other regimes, which are continuous for the most part. So sort of Singapore 59 onwards, which makes that makes it a bit difficult for me in terms of figuring out what's going on in Thailand. The overall picture here, not much change under the National Policy Council. It's probably worth exploring that more. And then Indonesia. Okay. The most amazing thing for me here is if you look over 1977, the standardized score for control, meaning how they use repression and cooptation, is 62. Okay. And then is from there that is a constant downward trend till we get to the fall of Suharto in May 1998 of 33. Okay, so a fall of nearly 30 points on my scale over the course of his reign. Also, no adaptation across there during the Cold War. Brunei. I'm not sure what to say about Brunei. Whether you judge it by its baseline or how much adaptation has actually occurred, it is the epitome of retrograde authoritarianism, meaning no adaptation under the Sultan since his rule. Okay. I'm not sure if there's a story worth telling here at all, given what we know about sort of petro-states and how they survive, like Saudi Arabia, but the data is interesting in a way. Laos, for me, was the most remarkable case, mainly for lack of adaptation. Meaning my prior going into this was Laos and Vietnam are very similar in terms of how they rule in authoritarian terms. And I expected Laos and Vietnam to adapt really around the same time and for the same reasons and in the same way. But this simply hasn't occurred. So I would define Laos as a retrograde dictatorship overall. Okay? There's a high correlation between, or interdependence between institutions and control. So I think it shows very clearly that when they hold elections in these years, not only does the institutional value of their rule go up, or does it become more sophisticated, but how they control the election in particular is important. It's been suggested to me that what I need to do is to create an election year standardized score and a non-election year standardized score and average them out. If you have any thoughts about that, that'd be really interesting. It probably needs to be done. And then Vietnam. So Vietnam's interesting for me in that if you start at the Dong Moi 1986, the renewal period, you can see some sort of noticeable changes. So the use of institutions since then, the use of information since then has nearly doubled. Meaning it in 1986 signaled a sort of progressive change in how the Vietnamese Communist Party ruled. Meaning, not while the Communist Party remained in place, the way they ruled or the nature of their rule fundamentally changed. But an interesting event occurred here about 2008. There's been a noticeable change in how they use repression. Okay, whereas previously it'd go up for election year and then revert back to sort of the high 30s. It didn't do that after the last election there. Okay, it went down and it's continued to sort of go down. I wouldn't be surprised if I coded up to 2017, this would continue to go down. Okay, so what's that due to? There's a number of factors. Civil society activists have been prevented from leaving the country, which I would argue is a retrograde technique as opposed to co-opting them or using libel suits against them. And then anti-civil society legislation has become less sophisticated and more arbitrary over time. So that's the democratization cases and the retrograde cases. And what I'm moved to now is sort of the sophisticated cases, or what I would argue are sophisticated cases. So the first one is Malaysia, from up until 2014. What I thought I'd do here is show you, if you start, so Mahathir starts in 81, okay, finishes in 2003, and then Badawi from 2003 to 2009, and then Razak, who's been in noticeable trouble lately, 2009 onwards. So if you look at those three, if you divide it by leadership period, there's been a change between Razak and the other two in terms of their overall score. Okay, so Mahathir averages 48.8, Badawi 48.7, so almost identical leadership, and then Razak is 46.6, so a small drop, but I've been instructed by my editors, or the editor of the book, to code up to 2017, and I wouldn't be surprised if in the last few years that number has continued to go down for Razak, as he's been in noticeable trouble. I've only got 10 minutes left, so and so Cambodia, which is sort of the regime my research has been most directed towards since finishing my PhD. A number of things stand out. So if you start here, the Khmer Rouge period, very short. So a 12-point drop overall in 4 years. The Khmer Rouge was in 75 to 79 before they were ousted by the Vietnamese forces. Okay, complete disdain for the use of institutions as tools of authoritarian rule. They just got rid of it completely, and very arbitrary repression. Another noticeable change is the 1997 coup, where Hun Sen ousted Prince Ranarad. From there, actually the regime improves in terms of its overall level of sophistication. In particular, how they exercise control goes up considerably. And then finally, as I said earlier, if you've been following news from Cambodia, there's been a noticeable crackdown in sort of the last year, but particularly the last few years since the assassination of Kem Lay, civil society activist, and this is starting to be captured by the data set. It's a noticeable drop in how control is exercised after 2008. So the downward trends in Cambodia. So if I was to make a causal argument one day, I would look at this data and suggest that downward declines in the overall score might precipitate a fall of a regime because it's becoming less sophisticated and more retrograde over time. But I think it's probably too early to make that claim. And then this is a story from Myanmar or Burma. A couple of things stand out. So this is the most significant drop here, 1985 to 1988. So right before the 1988 protests in Burma. Okay, well, there was a 30-point drop in sort of 3 years, meaning the regime was losing control well ahead of the actual protests overall. And then this is when the liberalisation period started, so the 2008 constitution, and the numbers start to improve overall for the regime. So releasing Aung San Suu Kyi, lowering censorship, things like that, all captured, thankfully, by the data. And then finally, last but not least, Singapore was the case that initially gave me the idea of this sophisticated authoritarianism. I lived there for a year in 2012 and thought, oh, it's very democratic, even though it's authoritarian. And so I was happy to see that Singapore in the end was actually, by any measure, sort of the epitome of this symptomatic case of sophisticated authoritarianism, whichever way you judge it. So it has the highest scores overall, noticeable improvement in information management, correlations between control and institution regarding how they use elections, but the overall scores are very high up the top. So how would I summarize all this data so far? I have a question which I'm still trying to figure out. Should I judge retrograde and sophisticated behaviour according to the end score of a regime? So 1974 to 2014, what was it in 2014? Or the overall change? So this is how basically a summary of the retrograde authoritarian regime. So the first three columns basically show you whether there's been an increase or decrease overall. So all increases for information management, decreases for 5 of the 6 remaining boxes. And then this is the end score. So noticeably, Vietnam far less retrograde than Laos and Brunei. Okay, but in terms of overall change, it only went up 3 points in 40 years. Okay, so what I'm trying to figure out is whether I should judge it by this end score, 42, or this score here, 3. I think because I'm looking at adaptation, I need to look at the last column. In terms of sophisticated, the story is a bit different. You have a far wider distribution of increases across the 3 dimensions. Noticeably, Singapore, the only one to improve how it controls opposition leaders, civil society activists, civilians, things like that. And then end score for Singapore is 51. Okay, so the only one to break that threshold of 50. And then overall change, again, on that basis, it's the most sophisticated regime of 16, plus 16 points. Okay. Malaysia, I'm having trouble figuring out what to do here because Malaysia's starting year is an election year, so it's automatically higher than a non-election year. Okay, so 43 is its election year score, then 48, which would only be 4.9 increase. But if you do the next year, when it's a non-election year, it's 32 to 48, which equals 15 points. Okay, so again, somewhat of a problem for me figuring out what to do there. Okay? But the overall sort of picture is fairly clear. Singapore, as I anecdotally thought in the beginning, is the most sophisticated regime. Brunei down the end, and a big sort of variation in between. And then just to conclude, 4 minutes or so. So what I'm trying to do basically at the moment is really a theory building exercise. The existing scholarship, which I use every day and I think is great, has focused very much so far on the use of institutions, or nominally democratic institutions, to explain the behaviour and outcomes in authoritarian rule. And while I incorporate that scholarship, I think we need a broader picture of how dictators and ruling parties and military juntas, for that matter, go about their business. Okay, institutions are one part of the story, but how an election is held and how they use an auxiliary paramilitary force to support that election, and then how opinion shapers back up that process online, I think is very important to sort of try and incorporate into one picture. So this is designed, so the framework of design, which I would love to get some feedback on today, is basically capturing qualitative differences between regimes. Okay? Singapore and Malaysia, despite being both party-based regimes, are very different when it comes to the nature of their rule, as the data suggests. And Laos and Vietnam, as I learned, perhaps most surprisingly, despite both being one-party regimes with uncompetitive elections, it's how they're traditionally defined as hegemonic regimes, are entirely different sort of creatures as well. And so what I hope to do eventually, at least in the second part of this project, is offer a causal explanation. Okay? If you look at regions of the world in terms of democracy or democratization, it's Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa that have struggled the most overall since at least the end of the Cold War. Southeast Asia, at least for the data I've looked at, is the least democratized region of the world. What I hope to do eventually is to provide an explanation for that, pointing at the fact that perhaps it's because these regimes have just gotten better at their jobs. Perhaps they've become more sophisticated, and we need new ways to figure that out. And then just to finish, a nice plug for my previous book, which is available online for about $25. So. Thank you.